Please, human, help.
My mother is trapped.
Those desperate words from an alien child will change everything for Jake Reeves, a stranded ex-geologist fighting for survival on this brutal world. He's about to face a deadly, trembling field, a living quicksand, and nocturnal hunters closing in. But this plea isn't just a rescue mission. It's the first step toward an alliance that could defy a predatory corporation and rewrite the fate of two species. Will Jake's ingenuity be enough to save them? The sun beat down on cracked earth. Every shadow held teeth. Jake Reeves moved through the landscape. His boots crunched on dry soil. He kept his field notebook close, recording observations with a worn stylus. His entries were terse: temperature readings, water markers, predator movements. The planet was a checklist of lethal variables. He scanned the violet sky. Two serpents circled high above, their leathery wings catching the harsh light. They were patient. He knew their patterns. They would dive when he showed weakness. He kept moving, staying close to rock formations that offered minimal cover. His water ration was down to half a liter. He calculated the distance to the next marked deposit. 5 kilometers. He would need to ration sips, making each one count. Dehydration brought hallucinations first, then organ failure. He'd seen it happen to 2 others from the crash. The colony ship's remains lay picked clean weeks ago. Salvage teams took what they could carry and left. They offered him passage if he abandoned his geological surveys. He refused. The data was his only bargaining chip for a future off this rock. Now he was alone with his numbers and dwindling supplies. Survival meant isolation. He spoke to his recorder more than to living things. The silence bred a certain blindness. He stopped seeing nuance in the terrain. A rock was cover or a hazard. A plant was edible or poisonous. The native Azurans were just another environmental threat, something to track and avoid. Their blue-skinned forms moved through the scrub with unsettling grace. He logged their movements like weather patterns. Potential conflict zones, resource competition, behavioral patterns. He never considered they might have names, families, fears. They were variables in a survival equation. The planet's hostility worked on the mind. It sanded away curiosity, leaving only sharpened instinct. His world narrowed to the next step, the next breath, the next threat. He dreamed of engine hum and human voices, woke to silence and the buzz of predatory insects. He was a man reduced. His hands were calloused, his skin tanned leathery by the twin suns. He moved with an economy of motion, wasting nothing, not energy, not water, not hope. The horizon was a line he would never reach, and he had accepted that. Then a sound cut through the silence. Not the shriek of a hunting beast or the rustle of something stalking him. This was different, fainter, more urgent. That sound wasn't a predator. It was a plea. A voice cut through the buzzing heat. It was a small, desperate sound. Jake froze mid-step, his hand going to the knife at his belt. He scanned the red-tinted scrub, eyes narrowed against the glare. Movement. A figure emerged from behind a spire of jagged rock. It was an Azuran child. His blue skin was dusty, his feet bare and scratched. He looked parched, his thin frame trembling. The boy's large dark eyes were wide with a terror so raw it was a physical thing in the air between them. He took a hesitant step forward. Then another, his gaze locked on Jake. Please, human, help.
My mother is trapped.
The words were strained, spoken in heavily accented but perfectly understandable English. They hung in the hot, still air. This wasn't just a request for aid. It was an act of profound transgression. Every interaction Jake had observed between their peoples was one of mutual avoidance, a careful dance of fear and suspicion. His own logs were filled with notes on maintaining distance. The unspoken rule of this world was simple. You survive alone. Jake's training screamed at him. Disengage. Assess the threat. A child could be a lure. This could be an ambush. His survival depended on a simple, brutal calculus. His life over anyone else's. Complications got you killed. Interacting with natives was the definition of a complication. He had his own water to find, his own predators to avoid. He looked past the boy, searching the rocks for movement, for the glint of a weapon, for the telltale signs of a trap. But the boy's fear was a human emotion. It was a language Jake understood intimately, one he hadn't witnessed in months. It was in the quiver of the child's lower lip, the way his small hands clenched and unclenched. It wasn't the calculated aggression of a sky serpent, or the mindless hunger of the scrub beasts. This was a son afraid for his mother. He weighed the immediate danger, the risk of a trap, The cost in time and resources. The very real possibility that helping would get him killed out here in the open. Then he weighed the other thing. The weight of turning his back on that plea. The image of a woman trapped, dying alone while her child watched. The memory of his own isolation. The crushing silence that had become his only companion. His choice wasn't between safety and risk. It was between the survival he knew, a slow, lonely grind toward death, and something else entirely. The plea became a catalyst. It shattered the narrow focus of his existence. He looked at the boy Talok and saw not a variable in a survival equation but a person. The walls of his isolation crumbled in that instant, not with a roar but with the quiet, desperate words of a child. His choice was made. He gave a single curt nod. The boy's shoulders slumped in relief and he turned, beckoning frantically. Jake fell into step behind him, his senses on high alert, his mind already shifting from solitary survival to a new, unknown calculus. He followed the small blue figure, leaving the relative safety of the rock formations behind. The boy led him toward a shimmer on the horizon, a vast open plain that looked strangely wrong. His choice led him to a geological nightmare. The ground ahead shimmered, a beautiful and deadly illusion. It looked like a vast flat plain of sun-baked earth and pale mineral deposits. A thin heat haze rose from its surface, but the edges were wrong. The entire field seemed to breathe. It quivered in a slow, unsettling rhythm, like the skin of a great sleeping animal. Jake stopped at its border. Talok pointed a trembling finger toward the center. A figure was trapped there. A blue-skinned woman, Nara, was half submerged in the strange substance. It wasn't water. It wasn't sand. It was something else entirely. It clung to her torso, holding her in a suffocating grip. She was sinking, slowly but relentlessly. Her arms were free, but every movement seemed to pull her deeper. He recognized it from his geological surveys. A trembling field. He'd read the dry technical description in a damaged database file salvaged from the crash. An organic colloidal suspension. It looked solid from a distance, a stable crust formed by a delicate microbial mat. But the stability was a lie. It could not support concentrated weight. Anything heavy broke the surface tension and triggered a rapid liquefaction process. The substance would act like quicksand but smarter. It seemed to actively pull its prey downward. His textbook knowledge was a cold, useless thing here. It told him the properties, the density, the probable microbial composition. It told him nothing about how to pull a living person out of it. Dusk was approaching. The light was fading from violet to a deep bruised purple. Shadows lengthened across the barren landscape. A low chittering sound began to rise from the surrounding rocks. Night hunters. They were stirring, drawn by the scent of distress and trapped prey. They would emerge soon, swift and brutal and numerous. Time was not just limited. It was measured in minutes. The math was simple. If the hunters arrived before he got the woman out, they were all dead. If he tried to walk onto the field, he would sink alongside her. His own weight would be the final trigger that drowned them both. He stood at the edge, his mind racing through possibilities and dismissing them just as fast. Ropes would be useless without an anchor point. There was nothing solid to tie off to. Throwing her a line would only give the muck more surface area to grip. He looked from the trapped woman to her terrified son, then back to the shuddering plain. The hunter's chittering grew louder, a promise of shredding claws and needle teeth. He had to devise a plan that defied the field's basic physics. He had to outthink a billion microbes and a pack of nocturnal killers with nothing but the gear on his back and the minutes left in the day. His choice was stark. Attempt the impossible or turn away and listen to them die. He would not turn away. His salvation lay in everything he carried. He ripped open his pack. Its contents spilled onto the solid ground. He didn't see canteens and ration bars. He saw components, potential. A frayed thermal cloak, 2 short lengths of fossilized driftwood, salvaged for their unusual density, a coil of thin high-tensile cord, his multi-tool. The chittering in the rocks intensified. It was a rising tide of sound closer now. The hunters were coming. He laid the cloak flat. It was a large square of synthetic fabric designed to reflect heat. Now it would need to do something else entirely. He placed the 2 pieces of driftwood parallel on the fabric, about a meter apart. They were his structural members. His plan was pure physics. He had to distribute his weight across a surface area large enough that the microbial crust wouldn't fracture. It was a raft not for water but for a solid that pretended to be solid. He worked with a frantic, focused silence. Every knot he tied with the cord was a calculation. Too loose and the structure would fail. Too tight and he'd waste precious seconds. He lashed the wood to the corners of the cloak, creating a crude but rigid frame. Its success depended entirely on the fabric's integrity and the stability of the driftwood. He tested the knots with a sharp tug. They held. This was a gamble. Not a sure thing. The trembling field was a living system. It might not react to the float as predicted. It might liquefy instantly under the new pressure. The hunters might reach them before he was halfway to Nara. Every second his hands moved was a second the predators drew nearer. The sound of their movement was a constant grating reminder just beyond the edge of sight. Talok watched, his small hands clenched. He offered frantic instructions in his own language, a stream of fearful sounds that Jake couldn't understand. The boy's anxiety was a sharp counterpoint to Jake's grim silence. He pointed at the field, at his mother, at the darkening sky. His fear was a tangible force, but Jake could not afford to absorb it. He had to focus on the next knot, the next adjustment. The finished float was a pathetic-looking thing. A square of dusty fabric stretched between two sticks tied together with thin cord. It looked like a child's plaything, something that would fall apart at the first sign of real stress. It was a prayer, a desperate hope built from cloth and wood and a shallow understanding of alien geology. He lifted it. It was lighter than he expected. That was good. Every gram counted. It was their only chance. It was a literal lifeline, a bridge from the safety of solid ground into the killing field. There were no other options. The hunter's shadows were beginning to flit between the rocks now, dark shapes moving with lethal intent. Nara was chest-deep in the muck, her movements growing weaker. The float was everything. He looked from the boy's terrified face to the shimmering, deceptive plane. He took a final, steadying breath, his mind emptying of everything but the task ahead. He stepped to the very edge, the float held before him like a shield against the impossible. He pushed off into the unknown. Inch by terrifying inch, the surface quivered under his weight, a living thing resisting him. Each step was a careful transfer of pressure. He advanced across the trembling field, the crude float a fragile barrier between him and the hungry muck below. It bowed slightly under his boots, the fabric straining. A low groan came from the microbial crust, a protest against the intrusion. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace like a man walking on glass. Every shift in balance, every tiny adjustment, risked breaking the surface tension. One misstep would send the liquid substrate surging up to claim him. Dark shapes now moved at the edge of the plain. The nocturnal hunters had emerged from the rocks. They were low-slung creatures with multiple glittering eyes and thin whip-like tails. They tested the edge of the field with razor-clawed feet, cautious of the unstable ground. Their high-pitched chittering was a constant, unnerving soundtrack to his progress. He was a moving target, and they were patient. The fading light made them into shifting silhouettes, their numbers impossible to count. A dull, familiar ache pulsed in his left arm. An old injury from the crash, a deep gash that had never properly healed. The strain of holding the float steady, of maintaining perfect balance, made the scar tissue burn. It was a sharp reminder of his own physical limits, his vulnerability out here in the open. He gritted his teeth, pushing the pain down, forcing his focus outward. He reached Nara. Her eyes were wide, the whites showing all around dark irises. The muck was up to her chest now, clinging to her like a second skin. Reaching her was only the first part. The real work was more dangerous. He had to pull her free. He knelt carefully on the float, the entire structure dipping precariously. He reached for her. The organic muck gripped her tightly. It wasn't a passive substance. It felt like 100 small, strong hands pulling her down, refusing to relinquish its prey. When he took her forearms and pulled, the resistance was immense. It was like trying to pull a tree stump from thick, hardened clay. A sickening suction sound accompanied each tentative tug. Her face contorted in pain. Pulling too hard could dislocate her shoulders or break her ribs. Pulling too slowly would let the muck reclaim its grip. It was a brutal tug-of-war against an enemy with infinite patience. From the solid ground, Talok's voice cut through the hunter's noise. He shouted directions, a thin, high thread of hope. "Pull left, more left! The ground is firmer there." Jake couldn't understand the words, but the urgency was clear. He adjusted his angle, planting his feet wider on the shuddering float for leverage. He pulled again, a steady, increasing pressure. Nara pushed against the muck with her free hands, a frantic scrabbling motion. The substance gave a little, then a little more, with a sound like wet cloth tearing. It was a battle of inches. Each small gain was a victory. Each pause to reposition was a risk. The hunters grew bolder, a few venturing a meter or two onto the unstable crust before retreating. The last of the sun's light bled from the sky, plunging the world into deep purple twilight. The air grew cold. He pulled again, muscles screaming in his back and arms. Nara came free with a sudden violent lurch, half flying out of the muck and onto the float. The sudden shift in weight sent a shockwave through the microbial crust. The entire section around them liquefied instantly, the solid ground becoming a churning, hungry slurry. The float dipped sharply, one corner submerging. They were not safe yet. Freedom from the trap revealed a new kind of danger. On solid ground, Jake finally let his breath out. His lungs burned. His left arm throbbed with a hot, deep pain. The wound from the crash had reopened during the desperate extraction. A ragged tear in his sleeve now stained darker with blood and the clinging muck of the trembling field. He flexed the hand, testing the damage. The movement was stiff, limited. Infection was a real risk out here. He began to rummage in his pack for his meager medkit. A cool blue hand stopped him. Nara was there. She had risen to her feet, her own ordeal seemingly forgotten. Her large eyes were no longer wide with terror but focused, analytical. She motioned for him to show her the injury. She was not just a victim he had pulled from the muck. As she gently pushed his torn sleeve back to examine the gash, her movements were practiced, sure. She was a healer. The history between their peoples was a dark shadow in that moment. It started with the Skyfire event, the violent arrival of the human colony ship that burned across their sky and crashed into their world. It continued with the creeping expansion of the mining outposts, the silent fear and displacement of her people from ancestral lands. That fear was in the way Talak had first looked at him. Human meant danger. Human meant loss. She had every reason to turn away. She could have taken her son and vanished into the scrub, leaving the injured human to his fate. It was what his own people's survival protocols would have dictated. Prioritize your own. Minimize contact. Instead, she reached into a small, intricately woven pouch at her belt. Her fingers emerged holding a pinch of dried, silvery green leaves. She crushed them between her palms, releasing a sharp, clean scent like ozone and mint. This was sunfern. She mixed the crushed leaves with a few drops of water from his own canteen, creating a thick, pungent paste in her palm. Without a word, she applied it directly to his wound. The effect was immediate. A cooling sensation spread through the inflamed tissue, followed by a mild numbness that dulled the persistent ache. The paste seemed to contract slightly, pulling the edges of the cut together. It was a native remedy, born from a deep knowledge of this harsh world, a knowledge his geological surveys had never even attempted to catalog. His science saw the land as a resource to be studied, its value measured in mineral deposits and topological advantages. Her science saw the land as a life-giving whole, something to be understood and stewarded. This simple act was a bridge. It crossed a chasm of fear and misunderstanding. It was a first fragile gesture of trust. She did not speak his language, but her actions were a clearer communication than any words. She was repaying a debt, but it was more than that. She was demonstrating a principle. Her people had values that transcended fear. Jake watched her work, the practiced ease of her fingers. The exchange revealed a fundamental truth that his months of isolated survival had blinded him to. Not all humans were the same. The corporation that displaced her people did not represent every person from the stars. And in turn, not all Azurans were simple obstacles or environmental hazards. They were a people. They had healers and mothers and children. They had knowledge he desperately needed. This fragile trust, built on a desperate rescue and a healing touch, was immediately tested by a new threat. The threat didn't come from the wilds, but from the stars. A low mechanical hum cut through the natural sounds of the evening. It wasn't the buzz of insects or the call of a night hunter. It was the sound of engines. Human engines. Jake stood with Nara and Talak at the edge of the Azuran village. The settlement was a cluster of low, organic structures woven from living vines and hardened clay, built in harmony with the contours of the land. The conflict was no longer about surviving nature's fury. It was about confronting a calculated, systematic invasion. The true scale of the struggle became horrifyingly clear. A human mining operation had established a forward base less than a kilometer east. They had bulldozed a landing pad and set up prefab habitats on the shore of a series of crystal-clear thermal pools. To the corporate surveyors, they were a convenient source of water and geothermal energy. To the Azurans, they were sacred. The healing waters were the heart of their community, a place of ritual and medicine for generations. The company's presence there wasn't just an intrusion. It was a desecration. This was the confrontation he had stumbled into. A single transport skimmed over the ridge and settled on the village's outskirts, its engines kicking up red dust. The hatch opened. A man stepped out. He wore a clean company-issue environment suit, starkly out of place against the earthy tones of the village. This was Marcos. His title was Xenobiologist, First Contact Liaison. His function was something else entirely. He had become the company's advocate, its polished messenger for ugly demands. He didn't bother with greetings. His offer was colonial in its simplicity. Surrender the village and the surrounding land, including the healing pools. Relocate to a designated reservation zone further inland, a barren tract the company had already scanned and deemed worthless. In exchange, they would receive safety and protection from the planet's dangers. His voice was calm, reasonable, as if he were explaining a favorable business contract. He spoke of infrastructure and order. He never mentioned the rich mineral deposits his seismic scans had undoubtedly found beneath their feet. His offer was a lie, and everyone knew it. The threat made it an ultimatum. As he spoke, the shadows at the tree line shifted. Figures emerged. Director Harkins's security forces, armed with pulse rifles and clad in tactical armor, formed a loose but unmistakable perimeter around the village. They didn't aim their weapons. They didn't need to. Their presence was the message. Compliance or eradication. The village elder stepped forward. He was an old Azuran, his blue skin etched with deep lines, his posture unbent. He listened to Marcos's offer in silence. He looked past the liaison, his gaze taking in the ring of soldiers, the hostile transport, the stars just beginning to appear in the darkening sky. He did not look afraid. He looked resolved. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried across the clearing. "We decline your offer." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. The soldiers shifted their weight. Marcos's smile tightened. The elder continued, his tone final, absolute. "This is our home." It was not a negotiation. It was a declaration. A line drawn in the sand that both sides now understood would be defended. The resolution was absolute. The Azurans were not passive victims. They were resolute defenders of their land, their culture, their very existence. The company was not just an inconvenient neighbor. It was an existential threat, a machine of consumption that would grind their world into dust for profit. The plea of a child had brought Jake into a rescue, but it was this stand that revealed the real war. Jake watched the elder's unwavering stance, the way the other villagers gathered behind him, their expressions set. He saw their strength, a deep, stubborn courage born from a connection to this land he could only begin to understand. But his analytical mind, trained for risk assessment, saw something else. He saw the glint of rifle barrels in the twilight. He saw the armored figures. He saw the technological gulf between a people who lived with the land and a corporation that sought to own it. He saw their strength, and also their vulnerability. Jake watched the company's vehicles from a high ridge. The personnel carriers and scout skimmers sat like polished beetles on the red earth below. His mind, for months focused only on survival geology, on rock density and water tables, now shifted. The calculations were different. This was tactical. He assessed sight lines, terrain advantages, and choke points. He saw their movements, the casual confidence of the security teams as they patrolled. They relied on their gear. Their strength was not in numbers or training. It was in their hardware. Their superiority was a product of technology. The pulse rifles, the armored suits, the vehicles, all ran on high-density power cells salvaged from the crashed colony ship. Their comms, their sensors, their very mobility depended on a complex web of electrical systems. It was their greatest advantage. It made them fast, coordinated, and lethal. But Jake saw the flaw. Technology was a chain. It created a critical dependency. Cut the power and the armored soldier becomes a man in a heavy shell. The hovering skimmer becomes dead weight. He remembered his own close calls with the planet's wildlife. One creature in particular, the ground shakers. He'd logged them early on, giving them a wide berth. They were massive, six-legged herbivores, placid and less threatened. Their defense mechanism was unique. They generated a powerful, localized electromagnetic pulse when startled. It was a biological EMP, designed to short-circuit the nervous systems of the large predators that hunted them. For the ground shakers, it was a survival tool. For the company's technology, it would be a systemic kill switch. A plan began to form in his mind. It was a cold, dangerous calculation. Lure the company's forces. Draw them into a specific area, a known ground shaker nesting ground. Trigger the creature's defensive EMP swarm. The resulting pulse would wash over the battlefield. It wouldn't harm living tissue, but it would fry unshielded electronics. Power cells would drain in seconds. Rifles would go dark. Vehicles would drop from the sky. The company's greatest strength would become its most catastrophic weakness in the space of a heartbeat. He found Nara and laid out the idea. He spoke in low tones, using his hands to sketch the concept in the dust. She listened, her healer's mind processing the implications. She recognized the potential immediately. It was a strategy that used the land itself as a weapon. It was something her people understood. But her expression grew grave. She placed a cautioning hand on his arm. The ground shakers do not discriminate, she warned. Their EMP is a blind force. It would not distinguish between company tech and anything else. It would disable his own equipment. It could disrupt the village's few simple electrical systems. If the timing was wrong, if their own people were too close, they would be caught in the same wave of disruption. They would be rendered as vulnerable as the soldiers they sought to defeat. They would be left in the dark, surrounded by enraged, panicked enemies with only primitive weapons to defend themselves. The resolution was stark. It was a high-stakes gamble with no middle ground. Success meant disarming a superior enemy, leveling the playing field through raw alien biology. Failure meant being trapped defenseless against a cornered and furious military force. It was a plan that could save them all, or it could get every single one of them killed. The risk was absolute. There was no room for error. The plan required a perfect diversion. The ancient Azuran pathways were a natural fortress, a labyrinth of towering, wind-carved rock spires and narrow canyons twisted through the badlands west of the village. From the air, it looked like a chaotic jumble of stone. On the ground, it was a defensive masterwork, its complex geometry and secret passages known only to the people who had lived there for generations. The company's satellite imagery and drone scans were useless here. Their maps showed solid rock. The Azurans saw doorways. Nara listened, her healer's mind assessing the potential cost. She questioned the risks, her voice low. What if the timing was off by seconds? What if the pulse was weaker than predicted? What of the children, the elders? The plan was a storm that would rage indiscriminately, but she looked from Jake's resolute face to the elder's thoughtful one. She saw the alternative, a slow, certain defeat through bombardment and scorched earth. Preserving life sometimes required risking it. This was the only way that offered a future, not just a slower end. She gave a single slow nod. Her support was quiet but absolute. The elder listened in silence. His aged eyes took in the drawn map, the serious faces around him. He did not look at the immediate danger. He looked at the generations that would follow. His blessing was not given lightly. He placed a hand on Jake's shoulder, then on Nara's. His words were few. He gave his consent. This act transformed the plan. It was no longer a human tactic or a desperate gamble. It became a collective act of defiance. The entire village would own this risk. They would move as one. The resolution was a shift in the very air. The mood changed from grim preparation to focused intent. Jake looked at the people around him, at their set faces. He saw their acceptance. He looked at the elder. "A trap," he said, his voice flat. "Exactly," the elder replied. The word hung between them. It marked the definitive turn. They were no longer defending. They were attacking. They were choosing the time and the place. They were stepping from a reactive posture into a deliberate, high-stakes offensive. The weight of that decision settled on them all. The climax of their struggle would not be won by strength of arms. It would depend on perfect timing and trust. The ground shakers reacted as one. The herd's response was not a sound, but a silent, rushing wave of force. A visible shimmer distorted the air above the valley. A heat haze gone wrong. The bio-EM pulse hit the company's advancing line. Power systems failed. The effect was total. The lead gunship's engine whine cut to a dead silence. It dropped from the sky, a 20-ton weight crashing onto the rock-strewn ground. The impact sent a shockwave through the dust. Cockpit displays and instrument panels went instantly dark. All across the line, the same scene repeated. Armored personnel carriers slewed to uncontrolled halts, their drive systems utterly dead. Soldiers spilled from hatches, their movements clumsy and confused. Their pulse rifles were dark metal clubs in their hands. Comms units generated only a faint, useless static. The technological edge that defined them, that made them superior, was gone. Nullified in a single sweeping moment. Chaos reigned. The disciplined military advance shattered into panicked disarray. The organized squads became isolated clumps of men, blind and deaf. Their electronic ears and eyes rendered useless. They shouted to each other, their voices small and lost against the vastness of the canyon. They were trapped, not by walls or fortifications, but by the sudden, absolute collapse of the environment they had created for themselves. Their own dependency on technology became their prison. Director Harkins's team, so confident in their orbital overview and networked coordination, was suddenly alone in the dirt. Then the ground shakers charged. Enraged by the continuing confusion and the smell of fear, the massive creatures plowed into the stalled vehicles and disorganized soldiers. This was not technological warfare. It was pure non-technological force. A six-legged beast could shrug off small arms fire. Its charge could flip an armored carrier. The company's soldiers, trained for firefights and urban combat, had no doctrine for this. They were overwhelmed by raw alien biology. The battlefield became a churning mess of dust, screams, and the deep panicked bellows of the terrified herd. On the high ground, Jake watched the plan execute. He saw the lights go out across the company line. He saw the chaos take hold. His part was done. The trigger had been pulled. Now he moved to secure the flanks. Nara and Talok worked behind the main defensive line. They were not fighters. They were shields. They moved through the gathered villagers, the ones too old or too young to hold a spear. Nara's healer's instincts took over. She directed people into the deepest, most protected crevices of the stone maze, away from the stampeding herd and the panicked return fire of the soldiers. Talok stayed close to his mother, his small frame taut with fear, but his eyes watching her every move, learning. They reinforced their position not with weapons but with protection. They safeguarded their people, creating a pocket of calm order amidst the storm of violence Jake had unleashed. The resolution was written across the valley floor. The battlefield lay in utter disarray. Gunships were broken hulks already half buried in the churned-up dust. Armored vehicles sat dark and silent, their hatches hanging open. The company's arsenal was broken, a collection of scrap metal rendered inert by a force it could not comprehend. Their immediate threat was mitigated. The invasion had been stopped cold, not by a rival army but by the planet itself, guided by a desperate alliance. The roar of the stampede faded. The shouting of soldiers grew more distant as they broke and ran, pursued by creatures they could not kill. A strange, heavy quiet began to settle over the canyon, punctuated only by the groan of stressed metal and the lowing of the settling herd. The dust slowly began to drift back to the ground. In the quiet aftermath, a new bond was sealed. The quiet after the storm was a heavy thing. The dust settled slowly, painting everything in a fine red powder. The bellowing of the ground shakers faded to a distant rumble. The shouts of fleeing soldiers were gone. Only the wind remained, whistling through the canyon gaps. Jake stood watching the valley, his body aching, his mind replaying the moments of the EMP wave. A presence moved beside him. Nara. She stopped at his side, her gaze also on the wreckage below. She did not speak. She simply turned to him and pressed her forehead to his. The gesture was simple, no words, just the cool touch of her blue skin against his own sun-weathered brow. It lasted only a few seconds, but in that culture, for her people, it was not simple. It was profound. It was the highest sign of trust, of connection, of shared breath and purpose. It was a language far older than any words they could exchange. It was an acceptance, a belonging. It sealed a pact. It symbolized the full journey. It closed the circle that began with a terrified child's plea in the scrub. They had been wary strangers then. He saw a threat. She saw a monster from the stars. They became reluctant allies in the trembling field, bound by a shared fight against a common immediate enemy. That bond had just been tested in fire, tested on a battlefield. It had not only held, it had proven itself strategically sound. Their partnership was no longer just a matter of survival. It was a weapon. It had broken a corporate invasion. The man who had once sought only personal survival, who calculated water rations and avoided shadows, now stood with a new purpose etched into his posture. The isolation was gone. The narrow focus on his own next breath had widened to encompass an entire people. He was no longer just Jake Reeves, stranded geologist. He was a guardian, a defender. He had found a reason to fight that was bigger than his own life. The emptiness of the horizon had been filled with meaning. Their partnership was no longer just a temporary alliance. It had meaningful implications that stretched far beyond this single canyon, this one battle. It was a blueprint, a proof of concept for an entire world. It demonstrated that humans and Azurans could be more than enemies. They could be stronger together than apart. Their combined knowledge, his tactical mind, her deep understanding of the land, could defend this planet in a way neither could achieve alone. This was no longer just about saving a village. It was about changing the future. She stepped back. Her dark eyes met his. The unspoken understanding between them was complete. The gesture had said everything that needed to be said. There was no need for thanks, no need for promises. The bond was forged. It was in the set of her shoulders, the calm resolve in his gaze. They had faced death together and won. They had trusted each other with their lives, and with the lives of their people. That kind of trust did not need speeches. The victory was absolute in this moment. The immediate threat was broken. But as they turned from the canyon edge to look back toward the village, the mood was not one of celebration. The people were already moving. They tended to minor wounds. They gathered scattered tools. They looked to the elders for guidance. Their faces were not jubilant. They were weary, watchful. The wreckage in the valley was a warning, not a finale. They had won the day. They had not won the war. The victory was celebrated with quiet resolve, but it was not complete. The elders stood before the assembled village. The air still carried the sharp scent of ozone from the EMP, and the dust from the shattered vehicles. He raised a hand and the low murmurs ceased. His voice, weathered but firm, carried across the clearing. May the land protect its own. The words were a formal blessing, a quiet pronouncement, but they were also a statement of fact. It was the land, their knowledge of it, and their unity that had saved them. This was not a prayer for divine intervention. It was an acknowledgement of a new, hard-won resilience. It formalized the pact between human and Azuran, binding them to the world they now vowed to defend together. The village began to assess the new reality. Scouts were sent to monitor the wreckage in the valley, reporting back on the remnants of the company's force. They were scattered, disorganized, and leaderless for now. The immediate threat had been broken. The balance of power had undeniably shifted. For the first time, the corporation had been dealt a significant, tangible defeat. They were no longer an unstoppable force. They were an enemy that could be bloodied. This knowledge moved through the people, a quiet current of grim satisfaction. They gathered salvage tools, tended to minor wounds from the stampede, and began the slow process of securing their home again. The atmosphere was not one of celebration, but of purposeful activity. They were counting the cost and measuring their strength. They recognized this was not a final victory. The elder, Jake and Nara, spoke in low tones away from the main group. Their faces were serious. This was a demonstration, a proof that resistance was possible. It showed that their combined ingenuity could defeat superior technology. But it was only a single battle in a much larger war. They had struck a blow, not delivered a knockout. The company was a vast, resource-rich entity with reach far beyond this planet. They had orbital assets, replacement troops, and a relentless corporate mandate for profit. This setback would not make them leave. It would make them reassess. It would make them angry. Their next response would be calculated, brutal, and designed to eliminate the variables that had caused this failure. Future confrontations would demand even greater vigilance and cooperation. The temporary advantage gained from the ground shakers was just that, temporary. The company's engineers would already be analyzing the EMP event. They would work on countermeasures, on hardened electronics, on new tactics that did not rely on vulnerable ground assaults. The village's defense would need to evolve just as quickly. It would require deeper trust, more shared knowledge, and a constant state of readiness. The cooperation between Jake's tactical mind and the Azuran's innate understanding of their world had to become seamless, instinctual. There was no room for hesitation or doubt. The margin for error had just become even thinner. Knowledge and cooperation had overcome brute force. This was the core lesson of the day. It was not the pulse rifles or the armored vehicles that had won. It was the understanding of a biological phenomenon. It was the trust to follow a dangerous plan. It was the willingness to stand together. But the war was not over. It had merely entered a new, more dangerous phase. The corporation's defeat today ensured their retaliation would be more comprehensive, more destructive. The stakes were now higher than ever. It was a shift in the balance of power. The Azorans were no longer just victims waiting for displacement. They were a legitimate defending force. Jake was no longer a stranded survivor. He was a key strategist in a planetary resistance. This battle was the opening chapter of a longer, harder struggle. It set the terms for everything that would follow. The company knew their enemy now. Their enemy knew them. The next move was theirs. The horizon held both promise and peril. Humans and Azurans stood together. They faced not each other, but the direction from which the next threat would come. The cracked earth under their feet was a shared ground now. The closing tableau was simple. Talok held his mother's hand tightly. His small frame pressed against her side. He looked up at Jake, his large dark eyes no longer holding terror but a cautious, weary curiosity. Jake stood a few paces away, his posture relaxed but watchful. The villagers moved around him, their glances lingering on him longer than before. There was no celebration, no cheering. His acceptance was a tentative thing. It was in the way an older woman nodded as she passed him a water skin. It was in the way a hunter gestured for him to take a position on a watch rotation. It was quiet, earned, and fragile. This alliance was not built on friendship. It was born from desperation and raw necessity. It was a pact forged in the trembling field and sealed in the EMP-charged air of the canyon. They were allies because the alternative was annihilation. That understanding hung between them, a stark reality that left no room for false sentiment. Their trust was a practical tool, tested under fire and found useful. It was not yet a bond of culture or shared history. It was a mutual agreement to face a common enemy. That made it strong in one way, brittle in another. It would only last as long as the threat remained clear and present. The company's shadow still loomed over them. Its defeat was tactical, not total. Somewhere beyond the horizon, in orbit or on another continent, Director Harkins was recalibrating. The corporation's resources were vast. They would not abandon a planet with rich mineral deposits because of one setback. They would analyze the failure. They would develop countermeasures for the EMP effect. They would return with new tactics, new weapons, and new ruthlessness designed to eliminate the unpredictable variable of native resistance. The planet itself remained a lethal partner in this struggle. The twin suns still burned. The sky serpents still circled. The night hunters still patrolled the darkness. Survival was a daily fight, with or without a corporate enemy. The environment was a permanent, hostile third party in their fragile peace. But a new path was visible now. It was a narrow, difficult trail, but it was there. It was a way forward built on alliance instead of isolation, on shared knowledge instead of secret hoarding, on collective courage instead of solitary fear. This path offered a chance to redefine their destiny. It suggested that the future of this world did not have to be one of exploitation and displacement. It could be a story of coexistence. It was a dangerous hope, a slim chance measured against overwhelming odds, but it was more than they had yesterday. It was a possibility. Jake watched the horizon. He was no longer just a survivor. The selfish calculus of his own next meal, his own next breath was gone. His purpose had expanded. He was a guardian now. He was the keeper of a new, hopeful possibility. He had traded the empty freedom of solitude for the heavy responsibility of defense. He looked at Talok and Nera, at the villagers preparing for the next attack, and he knew his place was here. His skills of observation, his tactical mind, his stubborn will to live, these were no longer just for his own benefit. They were tools for protecting something that had become more important than his own survival. The story ends not with an ending, but a beginning. The plea of a child led to an alliance that defied a corporation. It started with a desperate cry in the scrub, a simple request for help that shattered a man's isolation. That moment on the cracked earth changed everything. It forced a choice between the safety of solitude and the risk of connection. He chose to listen. That choice set in motion a chain of events that would break a military advance and shift the balance of power on an entire world. A corporation with orbital assets and advanced weaponry was stopped not by superior firepower, but by a bond formed in a moment of shared fear. The story's core is the power of empathy and cooperation in the face of overwhelming odds. It is a quiet argument against the myth of the lone survivor. The rugged individualist armed with nothing but his wits is a compelling fantasy. Reality on a hostile planet is different. Reality demands trust. It requires looking past fear and recognizing a common need. The true enemy was never the alien environment or even the native species. The true enemy was the mindset of us versus them. That mindset kept Jake alone and starving. It drove the corporation to exploit and destroy. The child's plea cut through that. It was a human emotion, a universal fear, that bypassed all cultural and biological differences. It created a bridge where none existed before. True strength on this alien world does not come from technology or isolation, but from unity. The corporation's might was an illusion built on fragile systems. Their guns, their vehicles, their communications, all of it depended on a complex web of power and data. That web could be broken. The planet itself provided the tool. The ground shaker's EMP was a natural counter to technological arrogance. But the tool was useless without the unity to wield it. The strength to stand together, to trust a dangerous plan, to face a superior force. That strength came from the alliance. It came from the decision to fight for each other instead of just for themselves. Their combined will was a force the corporation could not quantify or defeat with hardware. Jake's ingenuity was the tool, but the connection was the engine that drove their victory. His plan was a good one. It used physics and biology against a technologically dependent enemy. But a plan is just words and ideas. It requires people to believe in it. It requires a healer to trust a stranger with her people's safety. It requires a village to follow a human's lead into a terrifying battle. His cleverness designed the trap. Their courage sprung it. His knowledge of EMP effects provided the method. Their knowledge of the ground shaker's nesting grounds provided the place. One was useless without the other. The connection fused them into a single effective weapon. The Azurans' knowledge of the land and their resilience became indispensable assets. Jake saw the planet as a set of data points to be logged and avoided. They saw it as a living system to be understood and respected. Their knowledge was not written in manuals. It was carried in stories, in rituals, in the memory of where the sunfern grew and how the trembling fields breathed. This was the deep map he lacked. Their resilience was their refusal to break. They had faced displacement and fear for generations. They knew how to endure. This was not a people waiting for rescue. They were a people ready to fight for their home. They provided the anchor, the purpose, the deep strength his survivalist skills needed to mean anything. Their story proves that even in the most dangerous environments, trust can be the most powerful weapon. It is a weapon that cannot be manufactured, cannot be bought, and cannot be easily broken. It is forged in shared struggle and proven under fire. It turns enemies into allies and changes the calculus of a conflict. On a world designed to kill, where every shadow holds teeth and the very ground can betray you, the most radical and effective choice was not to build a better wall. It was to open a door. This is only the beginning. The company will adapt. That is a certainty. They are not a single defeated commander or a broken patrol. They are a system. A vast machine of resource extraction and profit. This setback will be analyzed. Their tactical algorithms will recalculate. Their engineers will already be designing hardened electronics mitigating the EMP threat. Their response will not be another clumsy ground assault. It will be something new. Something designed to circumvent their new understanding of Azuran resilience and human ingenuity. The Azurans will defend their home. They have proven they can. They have the land, the knowledge, and now a new weapon. Hope. But defense is a reactive posture. The true test will be whether they can anticipate the next move of an enemy they can barely comprehend. The ending is not an ending. It is a provocative hook into an evolving conflict. The dust has settled on this battle, but the war has just entered a new, more uncertain phase. The stakes are higher now. The corporation's pride is wounded. Their financial projections are disrupted. They will invest more, not less, in securing this asset. For the villagers, the cost of resistance is now a known quantity. They have seen the wreckage. They have felt the fear. The question is no longer if they can fight, but for how long, and at what continued cost. The victory is a beginning, not a conclusion. It opens a door onto a longer, darker hallway. This fragile alliance must now mature. It must strengthen itself. The bond forged in desperation must be tempered into something durable. Trust born in a single crisis is one thing. Trust that must weather prolonged siege, scarcity, and the constant threat of annihilation is another. They must learn to communicate better. They must integrate their knowledge systems, Jake's technical and tactical understanding with the Azurans' deep ecological wisdom. They must train together. They must prepare not just for the attack they expect, but for the one they cannot imagine. Their survival depends on this alliance becoming more than the sum of its parts. It must become a single, cohesive force. Jake and Nara's partnership will be tested again. The easy part was facing a visible enemy across a trembling field. The hard part will be the internal pressures, the doubts that creep in during quiet moments, the cultural misunderstandings that are inevitable, the friction of blending two wildly different ways of thinking. The next threats will come in ways they cannot yet predict. Perhaps not from the ground, but from the air, or from the water, or through subtle biological warfare targeting their food supply, or through offers of division, attempts to split the human from the Azurans with promises or threats. Their partnership is the bedrock of the alliance. If it fractures, everything falls apart. The story leaves you with a question hanging in the air, as tangible as the lingering smell of ozone. What will this new united front achieve next? Can a geologist and a healer build a lasting resistance against an interstellar corporation? Can a handful of villagers and one stranded human outthink an entire military-industrial complex? Their first victory was a defiant no. It declared that they would not be erased without a fight. The next chapter must answer what they will fight for. A future, a home shared, or merely a slower, more dignified end? The potential is there, but so is the abyss. The resolution of this moment is a grim intertwining. The fate of two species on this brutal world is now knotted together. Jake's future is no longer his own. It is tied to the survival of Talok, Nara, the Elder, and every villager who stood their ground. Their fate is now his. For better or worse, they are bound. His choices will impact them. Their struggles will become his. There is no walking away. The plea of a child did not just ask for a rescue. It asked for a commitment. He gave it. Now they all live with the consequences. Their shared destiny is a path leading into shadow, and they must walk it together. Their journey has just begun. This story reveals the most alien frontier is not a planet. It's the space between distrust and trust. Crossing it demands more courage than facing any predator. That gap separates us more than any distance between stars. Consider the fragile alliances in your own world. The small collaborations you avoid. The shared goals you dismiss as impossible. Against overwhelming odds, that tentative first step toward cooperation is often the only real weapon you have. The next move is never guaranteed. The outcome is always uncertain. The next chapter is always unwritten.